When people picture Roman suffering, they think of gladiators, blood-soaked sand, screaming crowds, and a sword fight to the death. Brutal? Absolutely. But here's the twist. Gladiators were the lucky ones. Most Romans didn't fight in arenas. They fought in tunnels, pits, sewers, and smoke. They didn't get cheers. They got infections. They didn't die with glory. They died with a shovel in their hands, a whip at their back, or a lungful of poison gas. Because for every champion of the Colosseum, there were 100 workers buried under the empire. Their jobs weren't just hard, they were horrifying. One had you chained to a bench until your spine broke. Another had you boiling in animal guts and brain matter just to make leather. And one, it was so nightmarish, even gladiators pitied them. In this video, we're counting down the 10 worst jobs in ancient Rome. The ones that didn't come with honor, only rot. Some of them killed slowly, others killed fast. But all of them had one thing in common. Nobody volunteered for them twice. So think you've had a rough workday? Let's see how it stacks up against the empire that invented human suffering as a career path. Let's start at the bottom. If you wanted to eat in ancient Rome, you had to beat the rats to it. Grain silos, tenement basements, bathhouses, anywhere warm and damp, rats were already there. And keeping them under control? That was someone's full-time job. Rat catchers weren't issued gloves, traps, or proper gear. Most of them were given a sack, a stick, and a warning. Don't get bitten. Catching rats meant crawling into dark, crumbling corners of the city, under floors, behind shops, inside collapsed walls. You worked in filth, surrounded by fleas, rot, and disease. Rabies, tetanus, plague. It wasn't a question of if you'd get infected, but when. And once you did, there was no treatment. A single bite could mean fever, seizures, coma, and death. Sometimes you lasted a week, sometimes a day. And in a city of 1 million people, your replacement was already waiting. Rat catchers weren't respected. They weren't even noticed. No medals, no rank, no glory, just a paycheck. If the rats didn't eat it first, you could clear out an entire infestation only to find more the next morning. The job never ended, and the risk never dropped. You were the front line against disease in a world that didn't even understand what germs were. At least gladiators had an audience. Rat catchers just disappeared, quietly, painfully, and usually alone. But if you think chasing rats through garbage is the lowest Rome got, wait until you meet the man who cleaned the empire's clothes with a bucket full of urine. Want to know how Romans kept their dazzling white togas clean? They soaked them in human urine. That wasn't an accident. It was the entire job. Fullers were the empire's laundrymen, and their main tool of the trade was fermented pee collected from public urinals, stored in vats, and left to stew until it turned into a chemical weapon strong enough to strip grease, oil, and skin. A fuller's day started by stomping on soaked clothing inside giant tubs of urine, often barefoot and shirtless. The ammonia in the liquid acted as a detergent, but it also burned. Skin peeled, eyes stung, lungs took in fumes that made men cough up blood. There were no masks, no protective gear, just endless hours wading in acid and filth while trying not to pass out. And the smell? Permanent. Fullers were banned from most parts of the city. They weren't allowed near temples, forums, or public gatherings. Some landlords wouldn't rent rooms to them. Even their kids were bullied or refused entry to schools. You could spot a fuller from blocks away because the stench soaked into their skin. But the work never stopped. Romans demanded spotless garments, and fullers delivered at the cost of their own health. Blisters, ulcers, respiratory infections, none of it mattered. If you wanted to eat, you went back in the vat. Cleaning other people's clothes destroyed your own body, but at least fullers worked above ground. The next job? It sent you crawling into the sewers, where you didn't always crawl back out. Rome had a sewer system ahead of its time. Stone channels, flowing drains, even public toilets lined with marble seats. But when those systems clogged or overflowed, someone had to crawl in and fix it. That job fell to the Latrine Diggers, the men who literally lived and often died in the city's waste. This wasn't plumbing, it was blind, gas-choked survival. Latrine diggers entered pitch-black tunnels with nothing but a stick and a torch, crawling through thigh-deep sludge made from human excrement, rotting food, animal carcasses, and parasites. Methane gas filled the air. One spark could ignite it. One deep breath could knock you unconscious. If you passed out, you drowned. If the tunnel collapsed, you were buried alive. And if rats got to your body before your coworkers did, no one even bothered pulling you out. Infection was constant. Cuts on your hands meant tetanus or sepsis. Rashes turned into open wounds. And if you somehow lived long enough to make it home, you were still marked by the stench. No one wanted to be near a sewer worker. Not in the market, not on the street, not even at the family table. They were outcasts in life and invisible in death. But the city needed clean drains, and someone had to do it. The pay wasn't worth it. The risk was guaranteed. And the gratitude? Non-existent. You could clear an entire sewer system and still be treated like the filth you crawled through. Fullers were soaked in urine. Latrine diggers were swallowed whole by something worse. But if crawling through sewage sounds unbearable, wait until your job fills your lungs with poison and calls it a paycheck. Rome ran on lead. It lined their aqueducts, coated their cookware, sweetened their wine, and minted their coins. But before it did any of that, someone had to dig it out of the earth. That someone was a lead miner. And his death started the moment he picked up a shovel. Lead mining wasn't just backbreaking, it was suicidal. You worked deep underground in tunnels barely wide enough to squeeze through. The air was thick with metal dust. Ventilation didn't exist. Lighting was minimal. You sweated through your clothes before noon and coughed up blood by nightfall. Most miners started young and didn't make it past 30. The real killer wasn't the labor. It was the dust. Lead particles filled your lungs, soaked into your skin, and entered your bloodstream. Your teeth fell out. Your muscles stopped working. You forgot your own name. Some men went blind. Others lost control of their limbs. A few collapsed mid-shift and never woke up. The Romans didn't know what lead poisoning was, but they knew lead miners didn't last long. And for all that, you weren't even a slave. Many lead miners were free men, technically speaking, who worked for wages that barely bought bread. They couldn't quit. They couldn't complain. And once their bodies gave out, they were quietly replaced. Latrine diggers drowned in filth. Lead miners slowly dissolved from the inside out. But even they got to see the sun. The next job buried you in animal guts, brain matter, and boiling chemicals, and made sure you stank like death for life. Leather was everywhere in ancient Rome. Soldiers wore it, workers used it, elites sat on it, but behind every belt, boot, and shield was one of the filthiest, foulest jobs in the empire, the tanner. Their job wasn't just disgusting, it was dangerous, isolating, and nearly impossible to survive without scars, inside and out. Tanners started by skinning freshly slaughtered animals, often in bulk. The hides were thick with blood, fat, and leftover tissue. Once scraped clean, they were soaked in massive pits filled with an acidic brew of fermented urine, animal brains, and piles of dung. Yes, literal feces. The mixture softened the hide and burned the person handling it. Tanners stood waist deep in that pit, stirring the rot by hand or with long poles. Gloves didn't exist. Burns were common. Sores turned septic. And once the fumes hit your lungs, you could forget about a long, healthy life. But the real horror came after hours. The stench stuck to your body. No matter how many times you bathed, you smelled like rotting flesh and hot piss. People crossed the street to avoid you. You couldn't enter temples. Some districts banned tanners from living inside the city walls. Even other laborers looked down on you. And if you had a family, they smelled like your work too. This wasn't just a job. It was social exile in a cloud of chemical death. And it never got better. Once you became a tanner, there was no climbing out of the pit. You worked until your skin cracked, your lungs gave out, or your legs buckled and dropped you into the very mixture you stirred. Lead miners breathed poison. Tanners bathed in it. But even they weren't exposed to daily fire, shattered lungs, and molten death like the next unfortunate soul. Glass was a luxury in Rome, used in windows, lamps, jewelry, even intricate drinking vessels. It was beautiful, delicate, and insanely profitable. But the process of making it, that was brutal, fiery, and often fatal. The men who shaped Rome's glass didn't just mold art, they melted themselves doing it. Glassblowers worked next to furnaces that burned hotter than 1,000 degrees Celsius. They spent hours hovering near open flames, turning molten sand and soda ash into liquid fire, then shaping it with hollow metal pipes. One wrong breath, and you inhaled vaporized chemicals. One wrong move, and a bubble of hot glass exploded in your face. Burns were constant. Blisters became normal. And over time, those fumes you breathed, they cooked your lungs from the inside. Most glassblowers developed chronic coughs, vision loss, or heat stroke. Some collapsed mid-shift. Others dropped tools with fingers too blistered to grip. And it wasn't just the heat. Glass shards flew through the air like shrapnel. A single crack could send splinters deep into your skin. Or worse, your eyes. There were no safety masks, no goggles, no ventilation systems. You worked in sweat-drenched heat, surrounded by boiling materials, just inches away from permanent disfigurement. And when your body gave out, someone else stepped into your place, because the demand for glass never stopped. Tanners worked in rot. Glass blowers worked in flame. But both burned, one from chemicals, the other from fire. Still, neither faced the kind of public hatred, isolation, and soul-crushing trauma reserved for the next job. Executioners had one job: end lives. They weren't soldiers. They didn't fight in battles. They killed for the state, on command, in public, and without hesitation. Beheadings, floggings, crucifixions. If Rome needed someone punished, the executioner showed up with a blade, a hammer, or a nail and got to work. But the real punishment wasn't what they gave. It was what they lived with. No one in Roman society was more hated. Executioners were seen as cursed, tainted by death itself. They couldn't live inside city walls. They weren't allowed to worship in temples. Some weren't even allowed to bury their own dead. It didn't matter if they followed orders. It didn't matter if the person they executed was a criminal. Just doing the job made you a pariah. The work itself was relentless. You didn't just kill, you displayed it. Crucifixions could take hours or days. You had to prep the wood, hoist the bodies, and sometimes finish off victims when the crowd got bored. Beheadings needed to be clean. One stroke. Miss, and the crowd jeered. Botch too many, and you risked being thrown into the pit yourself. Some executioners were murdered by mobs. Others died by suicide. And the ones who lasted, they carried the screams of every victim with them for life. There was no honor in it, no promotions, no way out. You were feared, avoided, and remembered for one thing only: being the last face someone saw before everything went black. Glassblowers melted their bodies. Executioners melted their minds. But while they stood alone, the next job chained you to a bench, where you rode until your body broke or the ship sank beneath you. There was no seat worse on a Roman warship than the rowing bench. Galley rowers weren't hired. They were taken. Slaves, prisoners, and the condemned were shackled below deck, chained to oars the size of tree trunks, and forced to row until their bodies gave out. Sunlight was a rumor. Fresh air didn't exist, and the beat of the drum wasn't for rhythm. It was a death sentence in tempo. Conditions were horrifying. You sat shoulder to shoulder with other sweating, starving men, pulling oars for hours without rest. Blisters tore open, backs locked up, legs went numb from the iron shackles digging into raw skin. Food was a crust of bread. Water was rationed. Sleep came in short bursts, if it came at all. And if the ship went to war, you didn't fight. You didn't run. You just rowed faster while arrows rained down above. Rowers didn't get rescue plans. If the ship caught fire, capsized, or got rammed, you drowned with it, chained to the bench, still gripping the oar. Some captains didn't even bother unlocking the dead. They just cut them loose once they started to rot. And if you somehow survived the voyage, you didn't get a thank you. You got chained up again and sent out the next day. Executioners were feared. Galley rowers weren't even noticed. But the next job was worse. It didn't just surround you with death. It asked you to burn it. When death piled up in Rome, someone had to make the bodies disappear, not bury them, burn them. Plague victims, executed criminals, war casualties, even unclaimed slaves, all of it ended in smoke. And the man holding the torch? That was the corpse burner. This wasn't a ceremonial job. It was manual, violent, and revolting. Bodies didn't burn clean. Flesh blistered. Organs popped. Limbs twitched from the heat. You weren't operating a neat crematorium. You were stacking corpses like firewood in open pits, dousing them with oil and lighting them until the fat hissed and the bones cracked. Some days the smoke was so thick you couldn't see your own hands. Other days the smell stuck to your throat like poison. Burning bodies came with constant risk. Inhaling the fumes meant breathing in ash, hair, pus, and disease. If you were burning plague victims, it was almost guaranteed you'd catch something eventually. And nobody came close enough to help. Not the priests, not the soldiers, not even the family of the dead. You were alone with death every day. And when it finally caught up to you, no one would burn your body with ceremony. You just get tossed onto the pile. Galley rowers drowned in salt and sweat. Corpse burners drowned in fire and disease. But the final job on this list, it stripped you naked, chained you underground, and left you to die in the dark for a handful of gold. The Roman Empire ran on precious metals. Gold funded armies, silver paid salaries. But beneath the wealth was a hidden hell, mines so brutal, even hardened soldiers pitied the men forced to work them. These weren't miners. They were slaves, and they didn't live long enough to be remembered. Mine slaves were stripped naked, chained at the ankles, and marched deep into the earth with picks and baskets. There was no light, no ventilation, and no escape. Tunnels were so narrow you had to crawl. Temperatures soared, gas built up in pockets, and sometimes ignited. Roofs collapsed without warning. Every minute underground was a gamble between suffocation, cave-in, or madness. The work never stopped. You dug until your hands bled, until your knees gave out, until you collapsed from dehydration. Then they beat you until you got up again. Food was a handful of grain. Water, if it came, was muddy and warm. Sleep happened in shifts, right there in the tunnels, beside the same tools that would eventually kill you. Your eyes failed first, then your lungs, then everything else. You couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't even cry out. The gas burned your throat. The dust drowned your lungs. Most slaves lasted a few months, some just a few weeks. And when they died, their bodies weren't carried out. They were left behind, buried where they fell, replaced the next day. This wasn't a job. It was a sentence. And the only thing worse than working in the mines was surviving them long enough to remember. Gladiators had a chance. Mine slaves had none. And that's 10. 10 Roman jobs so brutal, so filthy, and so inescapably deadly. They made gladiator fights look like career opportunities. Sure, gladiators bled in the arena, but at least they had a shot at fame, food, and freedom. The people on this list, they drowned in piss, fire, darkness, and silence. No cheers, no audience, just pain on repeat. So here's the question. Which one of these jobs would you never survive? Chained to a bench rowing through salt water, shoveling corpses into open fire pits, or breathing in molten glass until your lungs give out? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more raw, unfiltered history like this, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell. Because we're not done digging up the darkest corners of the ancient world. Rome wasn't built in a day, but for some people, it only took one shift to die building it.